the revolutions that swept Eastern Europe late last year, only Romania's led to massive bloodshed. It was the most violent, the most confusing, and the least conclusive of all the uprisings. All the hatred, the fear, the rebellion was directed toward Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu, the Romanian dictator and his wife who had ruled this country with an iron fist for a generation. And the rage was also directed against their secret police, the Securitate. These were the men who had arrested and tortured and killed Romanians, spying on them, tapping their phones, bugging their workplaces. And when the hostility finally erupted, the battles were fought in and under the streets of Bucharest, exposing a dark world that still haunts the Romanian psyche. It's not overstating things to describe the Romania of Nicolae Ceausescu as a madhouse, in which the lunatics were running the asylum and the inmates were punished for their sanity. This country was, and to a certain extent probably still is, the nightmare that George Orwell evoked in his classic novel, 1984. It is a case study in the sustained application of psychological terror. You couldn't believe anyone, you couldn't trust anyone. Truth, like most other commodities in Romania, has been in such short supply for so long that to this day, conclusions are best treated as preliminary. Some of what we will show you over the next hour has never been broadcast outside Romania. Some of the video, shot privately, has never been broadcast inside the country either. This, for example, is something that most Romanians have never seen. The secret complex of tunnels under Bucharest from which Ceausescu planned to fight off the revolution even when it came. But when the revolution did come, there was no escape for the Ceausescus. No amount of eavesdropping or informing. No Praetorian guard of secret police could save them. During a quarter century of maniacal excess, Nicolae Ceausescu had dug his own grave.
When you heard the news that the Ceausescus had been found guilty and executed, what was your reaction?
I was happy about it.
The Koppel Report. Death of a Dictator. Brought to you by AT&T, the right choice.
Timișoara, remember the name. A smallish city on Romania's western boundaries with Hungary and Yugoslavia. In mid-December, Ceausescu's forces had crushed, not an uprising really, but a number of peaceful demonstrations there. Rumor had it that thousands had been killed. Now, in the early afternoon of December 21st, Nicolae Ceausescu was speaking from the balcony of the Communist Central Committee building in Bucharest. He denounced the Timișoara demonstrators as reactionaries and terrorists, hooligans influenced by foreign agents. Ceausescu was reasserting control. Beside him, his wife Elena and members of his cabinet. Before him, in Palace Square, a programmed crowd of hacks and cheerleaders. But as Ceausescu spoke, something unprecedented happened. From the rear of the crowd came the sounds of whistles and jeering. As an aide urgently warned Vin Insediu, they're coming inside, Ceausescu did something he'd never publicly done before. He flinched. The TV transmission was interrupted almost immediately, but the microphone stayed open, amplifying his confusion. The cameraman, alarmed by the crowd, had jumped from his platform, the camera tilting up to the sky.
So there was no one to control it. The cameras didn't show what was happening with Ceausescu. We don't have the face of Ceausescu during those 3.5 minutes of panic, because that's what happened. He and his wife were panicked.
Ceausescu's continued attempts to finish the speech were futile. It was the beginning of the end. As darkness fell, crowds in University Square lit torches and candles, and they chanted, Timișoara. It would become Nicolae Ceausescu's death knell. By 11 p.m., the shooting began. First, there were warning shots. Then, Ceausescu's men began the killing. Trucks were set on fire. The night exploded in fear and confusion. By morning, Bucharest was on strike, the crowds facing army units that had been issued live ammunition for the first time in 2 decades. But the soldiers seemed disinclined to shoot.
Around about 10 a.m., we heard from the street, everybody was yelling, come with us, Ceausescu will fall, now it's the time of the truth. So we tried to get in the street, to join with the people down the street calling us.
Securitate helicopters began dropping leaflets warning people to disperse. The crowds kept coming and growing, headed toward the Central Committee building where the Ceausescus were now trapped. The atmosphere was almost festive. Ceausescu might still be in place, but not in power. There had been a very few dissidents in Romania, their faces unfamiliar, but their writings intimately known through broadcasts into Romania from Radio Free Europe. One such man, poet Mircea Dinescu, who had been under house arrest.
I had been guarded by 18 Securitate officers for a whole year. But on this day, the neighbors told me the Securitate had left after half an hour. Some people in the street recognized me and started to throw me in the air. I was lost for words and living in surrealism. The people in the crowd said, "We're going on." The feeling was they didn't care if they were going to die or not. They were not going to accept the totalitarian regime, the dictatorship, any longer.
Word reaches the people that the Minister of Defense has killed himself rather than obey orders to fire on the crowd. With that news, the army is now firmly on the side of the people. Tanks actually begin carrying demonstrators into Palace Square. And inside the Central Committee building, panic has set in. The Ceausescus, their bodyguards, and 2 close aides make their way to the roof. Their personal helicopter, piloted by Colonel Vasile Maluțan, is already waiting.
They were so scared they didn't even have the energy necessary to walk by themselves. So they were being mainly carried, being taken along by their guards.
The overloaded helicopter can barely make it off the roof. It dips between buildings, finally clearing the rooftops, headed for Ceausescu's summer palace at Snagov, 20 miles away. The crowds have now stormed the Central Committee building, flinging books and papers and official portraits out of the windows. Volumes of Ceausescu's collected speeches are flung over the balcony from which he'd spoken only hours before, and ripped to shreds by the crowds below. On the balcony, an ecstatic chaos of people competing in an orgy of free speech.
They were transmitting all sorts of shouts like Ceausescu, the dictator, Ceausescu must be judged.
Among those swept onto the balcony, a professor of engineering, Petri Roman.
I was simply thinking that we have to state that Ceausescu is gone and that he's no more the ruler of this country.
News that the Ceausescus have fled spreads through Bucharest by word of mouth. It's not until the television station is seized that word goes out to the rest of the country.
I saw the soldiers on the top of the buildings, and I feared that there might be some bloodshed. Some of the people from the crowds got into our newsrooms. They wanted only books with Ceausescu's portrait and Ceausescu's writings. They took them out to the crowd and torn them to pieces. There was no violence at all. They were decent people, and they were overwhelmed with joy.
The first scenes of the revolution broadcast to the nation are those of ecstatic confusion. The poet, Mircea Denescu, is among the first to speak. Then an army captain, an architect, Mihai Lupoi, whose appearance in uniform has an electric impact on the television audience.
Everybody was excited, and the people from the country who didn't know what's happening in Bucharest, they were waiting for a precise position, for an explanation.
The presence of an officer in uniform was enough. Here visibly was evidence that the army was with the people. The Ceausescus, meanwhile, have spent a frenzied hour at the summer palace in Snagov. He placing phone calls. She ordering a maid to pack 9 bags with sheets, blankets, bathrobes, and underwear. Then they took off again. Ceausescu orders Colonel Maluțan to fly to a nearby airfield.
The next minute I had the idea of scaring them, telling them that our position was discovered by radar and we would be shot down in a minute or 2. He was very frightened and ordered me to land immediately. We landed and the Securitate guards stopped the cars on the road.
The guards commandeered a car driven by a doctor, Nicolae Deca. Shortly afterwards, the car broke down. A second car was commandeered. The driver, Nicolae Petresor, was ordered to drive to Târgoviște, an industrial city about 30 miles outside of Bucharest. There, Petresor took them to an agricultural institute.
He was looking at his watch all the time, then up at the sky, like that. His watch, then the sky.
As would emerge 3 days later, Ceausescu had a radio beacon in his watch.
He was definitely waiting for someone to rescue him.
But rescue never came. Within 2 hours, both of them were in army custody. At the Central Committee building, meanwhile, crowds continue in one office to vandalize anything that speaks of Ceausescu, while in another, the former Prime Minister and his deputy try to cut a deal. Within an hour, though, Prime Minister Descălescu is paraded onto the balcony to deliver his public resignation to the jeers of the crowd below. In another office, a few hours later, the patchwork of an interim government is hastily stitched together. The engineering professor, Petra Roman, is named Prime Minister. The dissident and former diplomat Silviu Brucan is named second vice president. And then there is Ion Iliescu, who until the mid-70s was a minister in Ceausescu's government. He is now the new president of Romania. It is Iliescu, early that evening, who returns to the balcony to report that Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu have been captured. The picture seems complete. The crowd is euphoric. The emblem of Ceausescu's regime has been cut from the heart of the national flag. People are cheering, dancing, preparing to celebrate till dawn. The leaders of the new government are fixed in spotlights trained on the balcony. Easy targets for Securitate sharpshooters already tucked away in buildings circling Palace Square, facing the balcony. For the next 2 hours, for some still unexplained reason, they hold their fire. Then, all hell breaks loose.
Everybody was shouting, everybody was running, everybody was trying to escape. One thing is for sure that I saw people killed, shooting down the street.
But none of the fire was directed at the Central Committee building. A possible reason? Leaders from the old government were still trapped inside. As the evening wears on, the tension and confusion are palpable. A home video camera records the fraying of tempers on the 5th floor, where two hated cabinet members are negotiating for their lives. General Ion Dinka, the Communist Party chief, is relieved of his necktie and then, carefully but firmly, trussed up with it. Tudor Postelnico, Minister of the Interior, is pitched onto the floor next to Dinka to face a gunpoint interrogation. The military situation outside, though, is deteriorating. There is unremitting gunfire from Securitate forces. The only fresh piece of good news that evening is broadcast on television at 10:30. Ceausescu's son, Nicu, almost as despised as his parents, has been captured and is hustled into a studio before the cameras. It is scant consolation to General Stefan Gușa, the Army Chief of Staff. Securitate forces are staging a blistering counter-revolution. At times, the camera records events that border on farce. Gușa receives a telephoned offer of help from the Hungarian Ministry of Defense.
English, alo. Eftimescu.
Neither the caller nor the general speaks the other's language. A student acts as intermediary, using broken Russian. Gușa, distracted and impatient, turns the offer down. He accepts help, however, from an even more unlikely source, General Iulian Vlad, chief of the Securitate. He has pronounced himself a convert to the revolution and is believed. General Gușa proposes that Vlad broadcast a message to his men, who are still firing on the people outside, ordering them to lay down their weapons. Just before 6 in the morning, coached by a student who drafts the message, Vlad phones it in to the television station. 10 minutes later, as Generals Vlad and Gușa listen, the message airs to a ripple of applause. It has no effect whatsoever. By daybreak of December 23rd, the battle for Romania hung in the balance. There was heavy fighting between the army and elite forces of the secret police, the Securitate. There are two key objectives: the airport, which is under withering gunfire from Securitate, and the television station. It has been under assault now for almost 10 hours.
We became trapped, and the trap was getting, how to say, stronger and stronger, because they started to shoot in the building. And even on this corridor here, which is near the studio number 4, we were not able to leave the rooms in which we were trapped at the moment. We had to stay there sometimes for a couple of hours.
They were shooting from the block of offices, which is opposite the studio building, down to the studio building. They knew perfectly well where the broadcast was being done. A helicopter overflew the area around the Romanian television, and they tried to machine gun the people gathered here. Of course, I feared for myself and for my colleagues, but they were still doing their job there. We said there was no sense to stop, especially when the Romanian television, it was obvious that was part of the revolution. We could reach any part of the country with our cameras, with our pictures, with our broadcast. I think it is the first time when one can watch on TV a revolution live.
At the airport, meanwhile, the battle has begun to turn. There's a final convulsion of fighting as Securitate forces commandeer a bus in an attempt to break through the army ranks and escape. but they failed. And eventually surrender. As casualties mounted around the city, hospitals filled up with the dead and wounded from both sides.
We received here 691 wounded, and we had here 117 deaths. The main age, it was between 22 and 24 years. The youngest was 13 years old. A lot number of them were shot in the head. A lot of them were shot in the legs when they tried to run.
Those identified as Securitate were bound or shackled to their hospital beds. But it wasn't always easy to distinguish civilians from Securitate casualties, since the secret police often carried phony ID cards. Among those tied to their beds, a frail old woman whose ID card proclaimed her to be 103 years old. The nurses said the old woman tried to scratch them, refusing to eat anything but sweets. She had been found alone and dehydrated by the army when they were searching for medical supplies in Ceausescu's palace. She was the dictator's mother-in-law, abandoned when the Ceausescus fled by helicopter. A few days after this video was shot, she died. By the evening of December 23rd, morale within the new government, the National Salvation Front, is evaporating. At 7 p.m., a secret war council is convened. 8 generals from the army and former Securitate Chief General Vlad meet with 3 members of the National Salvation Front.
That meeting started with a report made by General Gush and General Vlad on the military situation. It was a bleak and alarming situation.
In essence, the revolution is collapsing. The army seemed to know nothing about Securitate's movements. Securitate seemed to know everything about the army. The question was, why? General Vlad's defection to the revolution, his participation in the front's innermost council, should have provided the army with all the intelligence it needed. General Vlad had sat at the heart of the battle for 48 hours of critical fighting. He'd rarely been off the phone. As Army Chief of Staff General Gusha sat across the desk planning the revolution, Vlad had been in position to relay that information to the very forces fighting to undermine it.
You must realize how encouraged were his troops and snipers, knowing that their boss is in the center of things.
It could also explain why those troops and snipers were so considerate about not firing at the front's headquarters in the Central Committee building. Incredibly, it took Brucan and the other members of the front another 48 hours to convince the army that Vlad was a traitor. On Tuesday, December 26th, he was arrested.
I think he played an act with the generals, and in the meantime, he instructed his troops to enlarge their operations to attack new strategic objectives.
The cost of that delayed realization was measured in hundreds of lives. Many of the dead lay in the street, frozen reminders of questions that are still unanswered. Were the generals guilty of complicity or merely stupidity? On the streets of Bucharest, meanwhile, the army and the people fought side by side, rooting out snipers' nests in apartments and houses throughout the city. In towns across the country, the army hunted down and arrested members of the secret police. Also caught in the dragnet, another member of the Ceausescu family, daughter Zoya. Meanwhile, for the past 2 days and for the next day, Ceausescu and his wife are imprisoned in this army compound by night and driven around its grounds in an armored personnel carrier by day.
The discomfort was intentional, if you will. It also showed the soldiers that those who did so much, so many bad things to the country, were in a very small place, far away from the palaces they were accustomed to.
The Securitate apparently suspected where the Ceausescus were being held. Twice in 2 days they attacked this garrison in an attempt to free them.
We were afraid that they will mount a much more serious attack on that garrison. And we decided to have a summary trial the next day, Monday, and the sentence to be immediately executed.
Christmas Day. The army released the Ceausescus from their mobile prison in the armored personnel carrier. Ceausescu apparently still believing that his position was known to Securitate because of a transmitter that he wore.
We didn't know that keeping them in the armored car was very safe because they had a beeper in the watch. It was just we were lucky.
Lucky because the armored car apparently shielded the signal and made the transmitter useless. Even as the Ceausescus went on trial, he still seemed to be expecting a last-minute rescue by the Securitate.
To the process, he was playing all the time with his watch, looking at it. We were very confused. Why did he look all the time to his watch? What he was waiting for? That's a normal question, huh?
The rescue Ceausescu hoped for never happened. During the trial, which lasted only 3 hours, the couple was angry, contemptuous, unwilling to recognize the legitimacy of the court. They seemed unaware, or at least unwilling, to concede the gravity of their situation. It was a charade. Their fate had already been sealed. The trial was nothing more than a formality.
And we decided to shoot them, but first we had to judge them. In my opinion, this judgment wasn't necessary, but for the general impression, we had to do it. At the beginning, he refused to talk. He called all the time to be judged by the National Assembly. To the end, he began to be afraid when he realized that he would be shot. He realized that. She didn't. She didn't all the time. To the end, when they were tying their hands, he was very calm. But she said to the people trying to tie her hands to be careful with her hands because it could be broken. It doesn't matter if they are broken or not when you are going to die in 5 minutes, huh?
Sentence and execution occurred in a matter of minutes.
We took them out, put them to the wall, and asked the people who wants to shoot. Everybody wanted. So they selected 3 people, and they didn't wait for the command to shoot. They shot before. 3 guns, 90 bullets. I don't know if all of them were in the body, but nobody counted.
I was happy about it. I saw as a whole Romanian people. They deserved it. Perhaps it would have been better not to sentence them to death. But to give them a chance to see the dimension of the disaster they have left and the dimension of the popular feeling about them. That would have been a much more serious sentence than death.
The Koppel Report continues.
They took a children's playground just on the other side of that wall from an existing cemetery, and they turned it into a final resting place for some of the martyrs of the revolution. It is called the Young Heroes Cemetery, and most of the wooden crosses explain why. They were all killed in December of 1989, many of them only children in their teens or young men and women in their 20s and 30s. Their surviving friends and relatives know why they died. They died for the revolution. Nor is there any question that revolution was necessary. Romania under Ceausescu was a terrible place, where fear was a constant companion.
In every place there were informers, even in the street, in the factories, everywhere there were informers.
This system was even more perfect than what was 1984.
General Jan Pacepa should know. Until 1978, he was chief of Romania's espionage service. He is, to this day, still under a death sentence in Romania and asked to be videotaped in shadow. Securitate claims, says Pacepa, the ability to monitor 1 million phones and concealed microphones.
To learn, if you want, how they make love, to know everything. As Ceausescu used to say, that was my opinion poll.
So, here it is, Securitate's main listening center in Bucharest, the principal monitoring location for the Romanian secret police. It is, to put it gently, something of a letdown. Rather like the scene in The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy pulls back the curtain to reveal not the all-knowing, all-powerful wizard, but a rather frightened little man who has inspired fear and trembling with smoke and mirrors. Not that telephones weren't bugged in Romania. Thousands were, perhaps even tens of thousands. And the fear that Nicolae Ceausescu inspired was all too real. Romania is an example of mass paranoia, and it was deliberately induced. I asked a group of Romanians if they knew of anyone who'd been arrested or disappeared.
Yes, we read about it in the newspapers, and we saw it on television, that people were missing.
And we have here maybe 30, 40, 50 people around me. Has anyone here had the personal experience of a neighbor, a friend, a family member disappearing or being arrested by Securitate?
No.
Not one? It happened, of course. People were arrested, tortured, exiled, or simply disappeared. But much of it was deliberate distortion, disinformation. While the state media portrayed Ceausescu as a demigod worshipped by his people, the secret police prepared for the day when the Romanian people would rise against him. It was the ultimate irony. The people were terrified of Ceausescu, and he was pathologically afraid of them. And so, under the very square in which crowds were gathered to roar out Ceausescu's name in a symphony of adoration, a complex of tunnels and bunkers was created. From here, Ceausescu and his supporters would organize a counter-revolution, if one was ever needed, or make their escape, should that become necessary. On one level of the tunnel complex, a line of shelves holding inflatable rubber rafts, which could be dropped through a hole concealed by a toilet down into the Sweetwater sewer system below. But at the time, we saw none of this.
A standing ovation. A standing ovation for 88,000 for Romania.
What we saw was the Romanian team at the '84 Olympics in Los Angeles in defiance of the Soviet boycott. What we remembered was Ceausescu the Maverick refusing to join the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. He had become, in fact, Washington's favorite communist, showered with loans, credits, and trade benefits. David Funderburk was U.S. ambassador to Romania from 1981 to 85.
There were pieces of intelligence information that I saw, and thus George Bush and Ronald Reagan and other American presidents had access to, that he is closely collaborating with Moscow, that he is killing pastors and priests and destroying churches, and jailing into a vast gulag of slave labor, political and religious dissidents.
Ceausescu and his family lived like royalty, but royalty of another age when monarchies were absolute. One of Bucharest's oldest and loveliest neighborhoods was razed to the ground so that the House of the Republic could be built. Bigger than the Pentagon, 3 times the size of the palace at Versailles, the unfinished building has already cost over $1 billion, with its marble columns and diamond-studded chandeliers. The Romanian people, meanwhile, starved, froze, and trembled.
Bread was rationed, meat disappeared, people were starving. Heat was rationed, you had to keep your apartment at 55 degrees. Bucharest and most Romanian cities became very dark. The streetlights were simply turned off, and so crime increased.
Last November, with another winter approaching, as communism crumbled elsewhere in Eastern Europe, Ceausescu had himself unanimously re-elected to another 5-year term and announced that there would be no reform in Romania. But in parts of the country like Timișoara on Romania's western border, television programs from neighboring Hungary and Yugoslavia brought news of what was happening. Laszlo Tokes, a minister of the Reformed Church in Timișoara, had preached about freedom and human rights. On December 15th, Securitate was going to arrest him. There was no organized opposition in Timișoara, but people came in separate acts of conscience and courage to protect Tokes from the secret police.
Lots of them gathered there only because they felt that there's going to happen something.
On the 16th, there were more and more people who were coming.
We were walking around the city and we were yelling, "Romanians, join us! Freedom! Death for Ceausescu!"
It was unbelievable what I saw on the 17th.
Bullets flying everywhere. They just shot everybody. Lots of them died. It was just horrible.
The children were unbelievably brave. They were the soul of our revolution. They tried with bare hands to destroy those tanks.
Sounds of the shooting and the screams of people were smuggled out of the country on an audio tape, which, in turn, was broadcast back into Romania on Radio Free Europe.
We kept broadcasting this tape the whole night.
On December 18th, armored personnel carriers swept into a square in front of Timișoara's cathedral, where a group of children was holding a candlelight vigil. News that the children had been massacred spread by word of mouth and was also reported on Radio Free Europe. But this home video shows the cathedral steps just after the shooting. The steps are empty. The children have fled, and witnesses now confirm that there was no mass killing at the cathedral. The story of the massacre, however, added to exaggerated casualty reports from the previous day, sweeps the country. And the name Timișoara becomes a battle cry that will echo in Nicolae Ceausescu's ears a few days later. So they executed the hated dictator and his hated wife. Free elections were promised, and there was a spirit of hope in the land for a few days. On the day the Ceausescus were shot, Romanians, for the first time in many years, celebrated Christmas. And the dawn of 1990 was full of promise and a great many unanswered questions. How many people did die in the revolution? Certainly not the figures of 60 to 80,000 once broadcast by Romanian television.
The toll is 1,800 dead.
And those gruesome pictures of bodies that we saw late last December, a lot of them, we're now told, were dug up from a communal pauper's grave. Nothing to do with the revolution. And what happened to those guilty of the crimes committed during the Ceausescu regime? So large and insistent were the crowds on January 12th, calling for the banning of the Communist Party and the reinstatement of the death penalty, that the three top leaders of the new government caved into those demands on the spot. The next day, both decisions were reversed. And when the demonstrations resumed, the National Salvation Front reacted by bringing in thousands of coal miners to chant their support for the new government's policies.
This is the style that Ceausescu used to use, and I think they're using much of his style.
A few people have been put on trial in Romania, fewer than 50 in all. But the trials also seem largely symbolic. People's theater. The accused already wear the garb of convicted felons, and when the prosecutors push a little too hard for names and associations within the old guard, the judges cut them short. There were simply too many collaborators in Romania's nightmare.
They use the same old slogans. Yes. They are the same people as they were in the old Communist Party of Romania.
General Vlad, for example, the former chief of Securitate, his trial could be infinitely revealing. He sits at home under house arrest. General Stanculescu, who served Ceausescu as the army's liaison with Securitate, is, as we told you now, Minister of Defense. Far from exhuming the past, Romania's leaders are now burying it. Our official tour of Securitate's tunnel and bunker complex under Bucharest makes the point. It only lasted 5 minutes. Instead of denying access to the rest of the tunnels, the authorities now deny their very existence. Aren't there several levels to the complex? We ask the colonel escorting us. No, he says there's nothing beneath us but the ground. But we have it on tape, I tell him. The toilet covering the entrance to the Sweetwater sewer system.
I have nothing more to say.
We encounter a similar experience when we try to gain access to a one-time Securitate bugging center on the top floor of Timișoara's Continental Hotel.
What is the army doing in the hotel?
In Ceausescu's time, the rooms of the hotel were all said to be bugged. The tape recorders and monitors were upstairs on the 13th floor. 2 officers and 5 armed soldiers respond to a call from the frightened man in the room. They, however, insist the room is empty.
There's nobody inside.
He assures me there is no one in that room
Noastră
right
ne
now.
asigurați că nu se află nimeni în interior?
Da.
Yes.
If you ring the bell, the man will come to the door.
Puteți face asta?
Da. Please. Da.
Deschide, măi.
Ask what's happening in here. Told you not to open.
When finally we gained access to the room, there were no tape recorders, no secret police monitoring hidden microphones, but rather the army running electronic surveillance equipment. Listening to what? They wouldn't say. But then, in today's Romania, it hardly matters. Any evidence of eavesdropping merely confirms a growing public suspicion that very little has really changed. Symbolism. There is a lot of that in Romania these days, but symbolic acts can be interpreted in different ways. They thought toppling Lenin would take a few hours. It took 3 days. And for some reason not altogether clear, they have saved the statue for the time being. There's symbolism in that, too. Where is this country headed? Even the Romanians, no, especially the Romanians, can't say. For the moment, the machinery of repression is in neutral, idling. It may be dismantled, it may be re-engaged. The instincts, the reflexes of 45 years of conditioning are not easily replaced. This is still an authoritarian country, nibbling tentatively around the edges of democracy. The Romanian Revolution just happened. It was an act of spontaneous combustion. And some of those who now claim to have been its supporters were, only a few short weeks ago, active and enthusiastic members of the Ceausescu regime. It is possible that they have all undergone a genuine conversion, but it is just as likely that they're simply using the overthrow of one dictatorship as an opportunity to try and replace it with another. I'm Ted Koppel in Bucharest. Good night.
The Koppel Report, Death of a Dictator, has been brought to you by AT&T, the right choice. For a transcript of this program, please send $4 check or money order to News Transcripts, Inc., P.O. Box 34100, Washington, D.C. 20036. The Koppel Report is a presentation of Koppel Communications, Incorporated, in cooperation with ABC News.